So today we're going to talk about the first archaeologically documented state in the world, and that's Uruk, Mesopotamia. Uh, the Uruk period more or less builds off of the preceding Ubaid period that we talked about before the last exam. So I want to spend some time today talking about the overall outline of Uruk society, run through the excavated materials from a few sites that really kind of help us to explain the broader picture of Uruk Mesopotamia, and then kind of bring it back to talk about social interaction in reference to the types of inequality that were expressed in the reading you read today by Reinhard Bernbach. So the Uruk period directly follows the Ubaid period, and at most of these sites, like Uruk, Eridu, and all the way up here in central Mesopotamia at Tel Uqair, we see very little. Here's Tel Uqair. We see very little stratigraphic breaks. So Ubaid society more or less directly gives way to Uruk society sometime around 4100 BCE. This is still one of the big questions archaeologically about exactly how this transition happens, because it's extremely poorly stratigraphically documented at the site of Uruk or Warka down here, and there's very scant remains from Eridu or Ur that really kind of witness this transition. So when we're talking about the Uruk period broadly, we're talking about a time period where we see the consolidation of those temple structures that we talked about in class for the Ubaid period sites like Eridu and Tepe Garwa, where those start to become the central focus of economic life. So what we start to find are complex residential centers with extensive defensive fortifications, massive central temple structures connected by roads, very strong evidence for craft specialization, large-scale irrigation projects that bring most of the alluvium into agricultural production, public art. We'll talk very succinctly about the Warka vase, and it's important for the iconography of Uruk Mesopotamia and maintaining this system of control. But because southern Mesopotamia is extremely resource poor outside of food, what we do see is an expanded network of long-distance trading. We talked about Ubaid Mesopotamia trading copper and obsidian from Anatolia, most likely for textiles. We can see the same type of thing happening here, only in addition to copper and timber and obsidian, we see trade networks that start to incorporate more prestige goods like gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. And to kind of make sense of all of this movement of goods and people into the region, we see the invention of an accounting system that would develop eventually into cuneiform writing. So in short, what we see is it represents the first state system in world history. And this transition is largely marked by pottery. Uruk period pottery is completely distinct from the previous Ubaid ceramic tradition. Most tellingly in that painted pottery is near non-existent in Uruk contexts. The other thing that we see is the Uruk ceramics themselves are produced on a fast wheel, and this is used to expedite production. And so the non-paint designs are replaced with incised or impressed decorations, kind of like what you see up here around the shoulder of this jar. So during the Uruk period, we also see the introduction of mass-produced pottery in the form of the bevel rim bowl. And these are crude, they're mold-made, you just kind of press it into a mold, and you can oftentimes still see the fist impressions, the hammer impressions at the bottom of them, where somebody is making these incredibly quickly. And by the late Uruk period, they count for up to 75% of all the ceramics from an archaeological site of the Uruk period. So this appears to become the most ubiquitous and common form of vessel for Uruk society. And we'll talk about the ramifications of that in a minute. So if we kind of break down the 1,000-year Uruk period here into phases, we can see there are three broad phases based on the ceramics. The early Uruk here, we see this kind of plain gray wares. They're also mixed in with red slip wares. They're introduced on the fast wheel. And so this is our first kind of big break between the Ubaid period. But what's lacking here is that characteristic bevel rim bowl. That isn't introduced until the middle of Uruk, sometime around 3800 BCE. The bevel rim bowl starts to become common, and we have the continuation of these gray and red slip vessels to represent the daily pottery for spouted jars and storage vessels. In the late Uruk, by about 3350 BCE, bevel rim bowls become the most common form of the assemblage, up to 75% as we mentioned, and red slipwares disappear completely. So we all now are simplified to only producing that gray slip. So we have this kind of standardization of pottery present throughout the Uruk period. And the bevel rim bowls are really fascinating because these are crude mold-made pottery, and our best guess is that they functioned as ration containers to feed workers. And one of the reasons we tend to think about them this way is because they're found in elite institutions, oftentimes in large caches of bowls that were recovered stacked together in storage. And that's what you see here at Chogamish, is you see this rows and rows of stacked bowls that are almost like they're prepared and ready to be filled and handed out to workers. This was covered in the central compound at the site, so we can kind of look at this as being a remnant of those distribution. We also commonly find them in fields and irrigation canals away from the settlements, which is somewhat telling when we start to think about the context of where these things are used. So people are bringing them, or they're being used out in the canals as people are out working for the state, as we'll talk about. But the best evidence is the cuneiform evidence, which kind of records the payment of rations to workers in multiple contexts for labor conducted, for plowing fields, for gathering crops, for building temples, and for dredging irrigation canals. And the cuneiform symbol to eat actually includes, in the earliest Uruk period, the earliest forms of writing, a head with a representation of one of these bevel rim bowls. And if we start to think about that as representing to eat, the fact that most of the populace would have been eating and consuming food in the context of work as rations, based on the text from the labor payments, we can kind of see that correlation again here in the cuneiform with this very crudely shaped bowl that more or less corresponds to what would be a daily allotment of grain. Now, this probably isn't occurring as grain per se, but more likely as a beer or a porridge based on our understanding of the cuneiform documents themselves.